It was a freezing January morning in the mountains of Wyoming. The forest was eerily silent, blanketed by a thick layer of snow, so heavy it bent the branches of the towering pines. The only sound breaking the stillness was the faint crack of brittle twigs under the boots of Ethan Blake, a 46-year-old recluse who had called this remote wilderness home for over a decade. Ethan knew every inch of these woods. He could read the tracks left in the snow, distinguish the distant calls of elk from the cries of a hawk. But that morning, something felt wrong. The stillness wasn't natural. It pressed down on him, making his every breath seem louder than it should. And then, he heard it. A low, broken howl carried through the forest, so faint it might have been mistaken for the wind. But there was no mistaking the pain in that sound. It was raw, desperate. Ethan froze mid-step, his heart suddenly pounding. He scanned the woods, tilting his head to locate the direction of the sound. Quickening his pace, Ethan pushed through frost-coated bushes, dodging low-hanging branches that scratched at his face and jacket. The howl grew louder, more guttural, until finally, he saw it. In the middle of a clearing, surrounded by blood-streaked snow, was a wolf. A massive silver-gray male, its paw crushed in the unforgiving jaws of a rusty steel trap. The wolf lay in the snow, trembling, its ragged breaths forming faint clouds in the icy air. Its amber eyes met Ethan's. There was no aggression in that gaze, only a haunting mix of fear and resignation. Ethan stopped, his breath caught in his throat. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to leave the wild animal to its fate. Wolves were predators, after all. Unpredictable. Dangerous. But something in the wolf's eyes rooted Ethan in place. It wasn't just an animal lying there, it was a soul in pain. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stepped closer. The wolf growled weakly, baring its teeth in warning. The sound was hoarse, almost pitiful. "It's okay, buddy. I'm not gonna hurt you," Ethan murmured, his voice low and rough, like the crackle of firewood in the hearth. He crouched slowly, his boots crunching against the snow. The wolf flinched, its body tense and coiled like a spring ready to snap, but it didn't have the strength to lunge. Ethan pulled a worn handkerchief from his pocket and wrapped it around his hand for protection. His eyes flicked to the mangled paw, crushed under the cold iron of the trap, and he grimaced. Blood soaked the snow around it, and the wolf's leg quivered from the pain. Carefully, Ethan reached for the trap. The wolf growled again, its sharp teeth only inches from Ethan's hand. "Easy now. I'm just trying to help," he said softly, his words as much for himself as for the animal. The trap was old and rusted, frozen solid in the biting cold. Ethan's fingers fumbled against the icy metal as he struggled to pry it open. Time stretched, each passing second feeling like a small eternity. Beads of sweat formed on his brow, despite the freezing wind cutting through the clearing. "Come on, just a little more," Ethan whispered through clenched teeth. Finally, with a sharp snap, the trap released. The wolf let out a deep, guttural cry as its leg slipped free and collapsed into the snow. It didn't move, its body heaving with labored breaths, its strength utterly spent. Ethan sat back on his heels, panting as he looked down at the animal. The wolf wasn't just injured, it was broken, both in body and spirit. He knew the chances of its survival were slim. Out here, with a wound like that, it wouldn't last the night. And then Ethan did something he never thought he'd do. He took off his thick, weathered coat, wrapped it around the wolf's trembling body, and, with a grunt of effort, lifted the animal into his arms. The wolf's breath was warm against Ethan's neck as it lay limp in his hold. "Let's get you out of here," he muttered, trudging through the deep snow toward his cabin. As the first flakes of a new snowfall began to fall, Ethan realized he had just crossed a line he could never step back from. This wasn't just a rescue, this was the beginning of something that would change him forever. Ethan's cabin was small and modest, perched on the edge of the wilderness like a forgotten relic of another time. But despite its simplicity, it was warm, the soft crackle of the fire filling the space with life as flames licked at the logs. Ethan pushed the door open with his shoulder, the icy wind howling behind him, and carried the injured wolf inside. He gently placed the animal onto a wool blanket near the hearth, its silver coat glinting in the firelight, now streaked with blood and dirt. For a moment, Ethan just stood there, watching the wolf's chest rise and fall in shallow, uneven breaths. Its paw was mangled, the raw flesh exposed and caked with frozen blood. "All right, boy, let's see what we can do," he muttered under his breath, rolling up his sleeves as though preparing for battle. Ethan wasn't a vet, nor a healer, but years of surviving alone in the wild had taught him how to mend wounds, whether on himself or the occasional injured animal he stumbled across. He boiled water in an old kettle, poured it into a basin, and began cleaning the wound with hands that trembled, not from the cold, but from a strange mix of fear and responsibility. The wolf stirred and growled weakly as Ethan worked, flinching when the hot cloth touched its flesh. "Easy now, I'm trying to help," Ethan murmured, his voice soft, almost pleading. He crushed some dried herbs he had stored in a jar, a trick he'd learned from his father decades ago, back when they used to hunt together. He applied the paste to the wolf's leg, binding it tightly with strips of cloth he tore from an old shirt. All the while, he kept glancing at the wolf's face, meeting its amber eyes whenever they opened. And what struck Ethan the most wasn't the wildness he expected from such a creature. No, the look in the wolf's eyes was something else, something deep, almost human. It wasn't just pain he saw there, but understanding. Trust. He sat back, exhausted, wiping the sweat from his brow. "You're tougher than you look, buddy," he said with a faint smile, as if the wolf could understand his words. And somehow, he believed it did. The days that followed were like nothing Ethan had experienced before. He cared for the wolf as if it were an old companion. Each morning, he would check the bandages, cleaning the wound and reapplying the herbal paste. He left small bowls of broth and strips of meat by the wolf's side, coaxing it to eat. At first, the animal refused, growling low whenever Ethan came too close. But soon, hunger won out, and it began to eat cautiously. By the third day, the wolf no longer growled at Ethan. It simply watched him, those amber eyes following his every move. Ethan began talking to it, not in the way one might talk to a pet, but as if the wolf were a confidant, a silent witness to the storm inside him. "You're not the only one who's lost out here, you know," he said one evening, sitting by the fire. The wolf lay curled on the blanket, its ears twitching at the sound of his voice. Ethan's eyes drifted to the small, worn photo on the mantel, a snapshot of a family he'd once had. His wife, Claire, and their little girl, Abby. The memory of their laughter, their warmth, was like a blade in his chest. "I've been stuck in my own kind of trap for years," he continued, his voice breaking slightly. It wasn't made of steel, but it cut just as deep. The wolf didn't move, but its gaze felt like an answer, like it understood the weight of his words. Ethan laughed softly, shaking his head. "What am I doing, talking to a wolf?" he muttered, but the truth was, it felt good to speak. To be heard, even if only by a creature of the wild. Weeks passed, and little by little, the wolf grew stronger. Its coat regained its sheen, and its limp became less pronounced. The cabin, once so silent and lonely, now felt alive with the presence of the animal. Ethan had almost forgotten what it felt like to have company, to feel needed. But he knew it couldn't last. One crisp morning, the sun rising over the snow-covered hills, Ethan opened the cabin door. The wolf stood in the doorway, its head high, its amber eyes locked on the wilderness beyond. It was time. Ethan knelt beside the animal, resting a hand lightly on its back. "Go on, boy," he said, his voice thick. "You're free now." For a moment, the wolf hesitated. It turned its head to look at Ethan, its gaze lingering as if it, too, felt the strange bond they had formed. And then, with a soft huff of breath, it stepped forward, disappearing into the forest. Ethan stood there, watching until the last trace of silver fur vanished among the trees. A part of him ached, a hollow space forming where the wolf's presence had been. But as he turned back to the cabin, he couldn't help but smile. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. The wolf had left something behind, a sense of connection, a reminder that even in the depths of isolation, kindness could bring warmth. Years had passed since that fateful winter. Ethan Blake's life continued much as it always had, silent, predictable, and solitary. But no matter how many seasons came and went, he could never forget those amber eyes. The wolf had left something in him that he couldn't explain, something that had shifted the weight of his loneliness. Sometimes, on cold nights, Ethan would sit by the fire, staring at the dark forest outside his window, wondering if the wolf was still out there somewhere, alive and wild, thriving as it should. He doubted he'd ever see it again. Wolves didn't come back. That was the way of the wild, wasn't it? But then came a winter fiercer than any Ethan had endured before. The snow piled high around the cabin, the wind howled like a ghost in the eaves, and the temperature dropped so low that even the fire struggled to warm the small room. It was during one of these frigid nights, long past midnight, that something happened Ethan would never forget. He woke with a start, his ears pricking at a sound outside. At first, he thought it was the wind, the constant groan of the storm pressing against the cabin walls. But no, this was different. It was a sound of movement. Paw steps. A low, urgent growl. Ethan's heart began to race. Grabbing the flashlight from his bedside table, he pulled on his coat and boots and crept to the door. Every instinct told him to be cautious, but something deeper, a gut feeling he couldn't ignore, drove him to open it. As the door creaked open, the freezing wind whipped through the room, biting at his skin. Ethan raised the flashlight and scanned the snowy darkness. And then, there they were. Him. Standing just a few feet from the cabin was the wolf, the same wolf from years ago. Its silver-gray coat shimmered in the pale moonlight, and its eyes, those unmistakable amber eyes, stared straight at Ethan. But the wolf wasn't alone. Behind it, trembling and barely able to stand, was a smaller wolf, a juvenile, no more than a year old. Its fur was matted with blood, and it limped badly, one leg dragging through the snow. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The older wolf growled low, not in warning, but in urgency, as if calling Ethan to action. For a moment, Ethan stood frozen, disbelief washing over him like a wave. This couldn't be real. Wolves didn't come back. They didn't ask for help. And yet here it was, This creature he had once saved, now standing on his doorstep, bringing with it another life in desperate need. The weight of the moment hit him like a punch to the chest. This wasn't just chance. It couldn't be. "You've got to be kidding me," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. But he didn't hesitate. He swung the door open wider and stepped into the cold, his boots crunching against the snow. "All right, come on. Let's get you both inside," he said, his voice soft but steady. The older wolf stepped forward first, its head low as it passed by Ethan, brushing against his side as though to say, "I trust you." The smaller wolf hesitated, whimpering in pain, until the older one turned and nudged it gently with its nose. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire seemed to envelop the wolves immediately. Ethan quickly spread out a blanket by the hearth, motioning for them to lie down. The older wolf settled in the corner, its piercing eyes never leaving Ethan, watching him with a quiet intensity that felt almost human. Ethan knelt beside the smaller wolf, who collapsed onto the blanket, its body trembling from exhaustion and cold. Blood matted the young wolf's leg, and Ethan's stomach tightened at the sight. "You're in rough shape, kid," he muttered, his voice low and calm. He grabbed his supplies, the same herbs, cloth, and salve he had used years ago, and began working. The juvenile whimpered as Ethan cleaned its wounds, flinching with each touch, but it didn't snap or growl. It was as if the presence of the older wolf gave it courage, a silent reassurance that Ethan could be trusted. And through it all, the older wolf stayed close, its gaze unwavering, its body still. Ethan glanced at it occasionally, the weight of its stare pressing on him. It wasn't just watching, it was waiting. Waiting to see if Ethan would come through for them. Ethan worked quickly, his hands steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. He spoke softly to the young wolf as he wrapped its leg, just as he had spoken to the older one all those years ago. "You're gonna be all right, buddy. I've got you." When the work was done, the young wolf had drifted into an uneasy sleep, its chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Ethan leaned back, his body aching from tension, and looked over at the older wolf. "You knew where to come," he said quietly, his voice breaking just a little. "You knew I'd help." The wolf didn't move, but its eyes softened, and for a brief moment, Ethan thought he saw gratitude in its gaze. Real, undeniable gratitude. Ethan sat there by the fire, staring at the two wolves, a lump forming in his throat. He'd thought his time with the silver wolf was over. He'd thought that fleeting connection had been a one-time miracle. But now, staring into those familiar amber eyes, he realized he'd been wrong. Some bonds weren't meant to be broken. The cabin was cloaked in the soft, flickering glow of firelight, its warmth fighting back the bitter cold of the storm outside. The young wolf lay curled near the hearth, its fragile body finally still after hours of tending to its wounds. Ethan sat in his worn chair nearby, staring at the flames, exhaustion pulling at him. Yet his mind refused to rest. His thoughts kept circling back to the older wolf, now stretched out in the shadows near the door. It hadn't moved much since coming inside, but Ethan could feel its presence, watching, waiting. There was something unspoken between them, a tension that wasn't fear, but something far deeper. And then it happened. The silver wolf rose from its place, its movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. It padded softly across the wooden floor, its massive frame illuminated by the firelight, and stopped just a few feet from Ethan. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The wolf sat down, its amber eyes locking onto his, piercing through him in a way that felt almost unnatural. Ethan had seen those eyes before, wild, guarded, haunted by pain. But now, there was something else in them. Something softer, almost familiar. For a moment, the room was utterly silent, save for the crackle of the fire. Ethan felt as though the air had thickened, the weight of the wolf's gaze pressing against him like a tidal wave. And then it hit him. This wasn't just a reunion. The wolf hadn't come back by chance. It had brought the young one here on purpose, crossing the unforgiving wilderness in the dead of winter to deliver this fragile life to Ethan's care. It wasn't just instinct. It was trust. The realization washed over Ethan like a flood, and he felt the weight of it crush against his chest. The wolf was speaking to him, not with growls or movements, but with its eyes. It was saying thank you. Ethan's vision blurred, and it took him a moment to realize why. He was crying. His rough, calloused hand rose to wipe away the tears, but they kept coming. For years, Ethan had lived with a hollow ache, a burden so heavy he'd stopped noticing it was there. But now, staring into the eyes of this creature, a wolf who had every reason to fear humans but had chosen to come back to him, he felt something crack open inside him. "You trusted me again," he whispered, his voice trembling, barely audible over the roar of his emotions. Thank you for that." The wolf tilted its head ever so slightly, and for a brief moment, Ethan could have sworn it understood him. That night, something shifted in the cabin. Ethan didn't feel the gnawing loneliness that usually settled in his chest after the fire burned low. Instead, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace, an unfamiliar but welcome warmth that wrapped around him like a blanket. The young wolf continued to sleep soundly by the fire, its small, rhythmic breaths filling the room. The older wolf returned to its spot near the door, resting its head on its paws, but keeping its eyes trained on Ethan, as if standing watch. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze flicking between the two wolves. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He didn't feel broken. He didn't feel lost. As he drifted off to sleep, a single thought echoed in his mind. Even in the wildest corners of the world, there is a language of trust. A bond that transcends words. A connection that heals. Ethan hadn't just saved the wolf that day in the snow. It had saved him too. Morning broke softly over the snow-blanketed forest, the golden sunlight spilling through the frosted windows of Ethan's cabin. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world quiet and still, as though holding its breath. The young wolf stirred first, lifting its head from the blanket near the hearth. Its eyes, once clouded with pain, now gleamed with life. It stretched tentatively, testing its leg, and though its movements were slow and uncertain, it was clear that the worst had passed. Ethan knelt beside it, running a hand gently over its coarse fur. "You're tougher than you look, little guy," he murmured with a small smile, though his throat felt tight. The older wolf had been watching from its place by the door, its amber eyes filled with a quiet, unwavering focus. It stood and padded silently over to the young one, leaning down to nuzzle the smaller wolf's head. Then, with a deliberate tenderness that surprised Ethan, the older wolf began to lick the pup's fur, grooming it with care. Ethan knew what was coming. He could feel it in the way the older wolf began to glance toward the door, its body language shifting, as though the wild was calling it back. He rose to his feet, his hand resting on the door handle. "It's time, isn't it?" he said softly, his voice breaking just enough to betray the emotion in his chest. The older wolf turned to him, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. There was no growl, no movement, just that same piercing connection Ethan had felt since the first time they met. And then, as if to answer his question, the wolf stepped forward, brushing past him as it moved toward the open door. The young wolf hesitated, looking back at Ethan as if unsure. The older wolf turned and gave a soft, encouraging nudge, and together, they stepped into the crisp, snow-covered world beyond. Ethan stood in the doorway, his arms crossed tightly over his chest to keep himself from trembling, not from the cold, but from the ache blooming inside him. As the wolves moved toward the tree line, the older one stopped and turned back one last time. Its amber eyes locked onto Ethan's, and for a brief, unshakable moment, time seemed to stand still. It was a look of gratitude. A silent promise. Ethan's vision blurred with tears, but he managed a small wave. "Take care of him," he whispered, his voice almost lost in the morning air. The wolf held his gaze for a beat longer, and then it turned, vanishing into the forest with the young one at its side. Ethan stayed in the doorway until they were gone, the snow swallowing their tracks. He felt the weight of their absence almost immediately, like a door quietly closing on a chapter of his life. And yet, for the first time in years, that emptiness didn't feel unbearable. It felt peaceful. Sometimes, life brings us angels in the most unexpected forms. For Ethan, it wasn't a person, or a sign, or a voice in the wind. It was a wolf, wild and untamed, fierce and free, that had stepped into his life when he needed it most. The silver wolf had taught him lessons that words could never capture: trust, kindness, and the quiet power of gratitude. As Ethan stood there in the morning light, staring at the edge of the forest, he let out a long breath, his heart lighter than it had been in years. "Do good, and good will find its way back to you," he murmured, repeating the lesson he'd come to believe. "Even if it comes from where you'd least expect it." Ethan returned to his cabin, the fire now reduced to glowing embers. The silence inside wasn't the heavy, suffocating loneliness he'd known for so long. It was something else entirely. Because deep in his heart, he knew. Somewhere in that vast, untamed wilderness, the wolf would remember him. And that was enough.